Welcome to Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things, the podcast show. I am your host, Carrie Roberts. And today my guest is Taly Matiteyahu. She is the co-founder and the CEO of I like to say a dating experience called Blink. And I am so excited to have you here, Taly. Welcome. Thank you for being a part of this.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into your business, I want to talk a little bit about you. You've been in kind of the law space for a while. You're in the technology space, and then you decide I want to do something in dating. So I'm curious, what was this transition? What was kind of that moment that you're like, I think I want to get into this space?
Yeah, so I've actually wanted to get into this space for years. And I think what really pushed me over the edge was realizing there's never a good time. And it was right around March of 2020, right before the pandemic. Love is Blind came out, and the idea is kind of a Love is Blind through an app experience. And so I saw it and I was like, people would really be into this. What am I waiting for? Let me just try this. And the idea originally was supposed to be a live kind of blind speed dating event in blackout pods where you can't see each other. And then COVID hit. And so we pivoted into building an app and so on. And so it was this moment of realization, like there's no good time to jump off a bridge. You just got to jump sometimes and trust. And so that's kind of the moment. Like you said, I'm still, I've been in other spaces. I'm simultaneously working a day job. And so still holding on to the bridge with one arm, I guess, but happily dangling off.
It's funny you say that because I did watch that show and I was fascinated by it. And we did see there's been reunions and whatnot, and one of the couples did get married. They seemed to be happy together, and they both said, physically this isn't the person I would have, thought.
Yeah.
But they've worked out. I'm curious, for you, to what extent you want to talk about other dating experiences, because when we think about the apps and things that are out, I was trying to think earlier today. I mean, we had Match.com, which was more like email based, but kind of what we're used to has maybe been the last 5 or 6 years. You might know more than me. But what do you think, either from your own experience, from talking to other people, has been missing in terms of what's already been out there?
I think what's missing, two things actually: synchronous communication and personality first. And these exist in various forms in certain experiences. There's synchronous events like live speed dating and things like that. But in those scenarios, there's actually studies that show you're not remembering the actual conversations. You're remembering the most striking person you met because, you're meeting X amount of people and, it's a little overwhelming for your brain. And so your brain just reverts to the most striking person with the most striking feature. And that's what you're going to remember. And so we're combining the component of synchronicity and actually getting to know someone live, because it's very different to talk to someone or like hear a recording of someone through, an audio feature on an existing dating app, because you can script yourself, you can practice it. You have a different voice potentially when you're recording yourself as opposed to having a conversation. And putting personality first, because there's no looks component in kind of the early part of our experience. And so you're really able to get to know the other person. You're able to focus on the conversation. You're not thinking about what do they look like? What's their background? What's in my background? How does my hair look? Is my lighting okay? And so you're really able to throw yourself into getting to know the other person. And it becomes a lot more efficient to decide we're actually compatible. We're having a great conversation versus we're not syncing, like we're going to go our separate ways. Whereas dating apps, traditional dating apps, you're looking at a baseball card version of a person and you're swiping. So just, I think, like I said, synchronicity and personality first are the two things that are missing. And we're bringing both of those into the Blink experience.
Yeah, I like that you said it's kind of like a baseball card experience, because it is. It's like these pictures. And it's funny because I've seen friends and I look at their dating app and I'm like, that's how you're portraying yourself. It seems odd because I'm like, that's not how you are in real life. Like,
Right.
or I've been through and you look and you're like, is this person's best self? Like this is what they chose to write, or it's not spelled correctly, or this picture seems offensive. And so I know dating can be such a frustrating experience. I speak as a woman. I don't know from the male side, or, some people use it differently. Did you do any research or have certain conversations with men and or women about how they were feeling about the space and what it is that they felt was missing as well for them?
Yeah, so we actually did a proof of concept podcast where we had people go on these dates. The only thing they knew about each other was their first names, and they only found that out in the moment of the date. Like they knew nothing else. And all of our couples from our first season were heterosexual couples, so we had a balance. And not that we don't want diversity, we do. It just happened to be that was our matching, and who we had available, and it was incredible. Like people on both sides really enjoyed the experience, and people on both sides were like, this is so refreshing compared to swiping. And I think for men in particular who are, it's stereotypically men really care about looks. Not to say that they don't, but I think they're really tired of swiping. And men traditionally swipe right or say yes to somebody on dating apps far more frequently than women, and match far less frequently because women are more selective and they'll swipe right less often. And so men will be swiping, and then say, I've gotten one match in 3 months. That's a very poor kind of return rate if you're swiping for hours over the course of weeks. And so being able to go on a date, a 10-minute date, and actually have a conversation with another person and see if you connect or not, like that is a huge improvement from a man's perspective. And then from the woman's perspective, there's almost an overload when you're matching so frequently. Even if you're swiping left less often and you match very often, like then you're overloaded by messages, and that can be really overwhelming. And then who do you actually choose to go on a date with? And do you feel safe to go on a date with them? You've just seen this baseball card version of that human, nothing else about them. And so now they get to go on a 10-minute date from the comfort of their home. They get to know the person a little bit. That isn't to say suddenly you know them, and should go out into an alley as your next date. But at least you're actually getting to know the person as a person. And so we've gotten great feedback from both sides of the equation. We're looking forward to seeing what that looks like at scale once we launch the beta. But it's been a ton of fun to see, some of the stereotypes that we hear about men and women and how they think about dating. Some of those just don't appear to be true for everyone.
Yeah, well, and it's I always say you're really looking for one person, and that doesn't mean like the one,
Right.
but whether it's to date or whatever. So it's like sometimes when, we say like, oh, it's so challenging. It's like, well, of course it's challenging. It's a different level of connection you're looking for. So can you talk a little bit about how blank works, how it's kind of working now, and then kind of what you're looking to do with it?
Yeah, so the app, we're on the verge of launching the beta. We're waiting for the App Store to approve it. And the basics of the app will be you sign up, you put very limited information in. It's just your name, sexuality, location, your age. And then you put in your availability. You tell us when you're free for dates. Based on that, we match you for dates. The only thing you know about the other person is their first name. You don't see a photo, anything like that. You come onto the app when it's time for your date. You have a 10-minute conversation. And only if it went well do you go on to see photos. And when you see photos, you actually see only one photo, but you see 3 different people, and you don't know which of those people was the person you had the date with. And this removes some of the kind of potential disappointment of like, oh, they're saying no based on photo, or I'm rejecting them based on what they look like, even though I had a great conversation with them. And so it creates a little bit more psychological comfort, so to speak. And it also helps challenge people like, oh, you might have said no to this person had you seen them before the conversation, but now that you've had a really beautiful conversation with them, you had an amazing connection, you might actually be interested in them in a way that you weren't before, sort of like what you were saying with Love is Blind. I think it was Cameron, and I'm forgetting the woman's name right now, but they both said, I never would have dated this person had I met them in real life first. And so it's putting people in that sort of situation where you might match with people that you would never expect if you think about it a little bit differently.
And so when you have people that kind of sign up for this, are they putting any requirements, obviously besides like, okay, who I'm male or female I'm attracted to, or doesn't matter? Are they putting an age? Are they putting a location? Or is it just that one requirement?
It's age, location, and sexuality that are the 3 kind of limiting features. We hope to potentially add some more down the line in terms of like life planning, like if you plan to have a family or not. We currently also have some details about, if people smoke or drink, lifestyle type choices
Right.
that, might contribute to whether or not you'd be able to build a life together. You can't filter based on those, but you're able to see those alongside those nameless photos that come in after the date.
And so, okay, so you do this now. Are you guys working and acting like matchmakers, that you're looking at the people coming in and you're saying these 2 might get along, or you're just randomly choosing as long as they fit? Like, okay, this is a male in this age group in this location. We're just going to put them with it.
It's that latter situation. The algorithm is just like, this is a man and woman. They have the same availability. They have the age, interest, sexuality, like they're aligned. Give them a 10-minute date and see if they click.
I love that. So what is this 10-minute date? Do you give them are you involved? Do you give them a question? Do they just call each other and they interact? How does this work?
So for the podcast, I am involved to the extent that, I am the host of the date. I give them a question and then I just mute myself and I just hide for 10 minutes and then I come back on and interrupt them and cut them off and they get to say their farewells. For the app, there will be no host. There's no awkward third person, chilling and watching your date or listening to your date. And there is no prompt currently, but we hope to add that in the future because we think it's a really great way to get people to, talk about something a little bit more than small talk. So yeah, the app is sort of like, I don't know if you're familiar with Clubhouse where you just kind of open the app and you click join. It's the same sort of thing where you're joining kind of your scheduled date room and the other person, they join as well. It gives you a little countdown so you know how long you've got left. And then the date will automatically end once the 10 minutes passed.
And so what has been, and you can listen to the podcast. What is the name of the podcast?
Date in a Blink.
Date in a Blink. So I've listened to it. And I think it's really cool how you do it. And it's interesting because when you're listening to people, which is similar to what I do with podcasts, actually before the pandemic, I only did audio and now I do video as well. And people just let their guard down. They feel comfortable. You take the pressure off. This has to be something, or I have to act a certain way. I can just be a person, which is how we should be all the time, but, from society or culture, it's shifted. So when they're, doing this, from the ones you've done so far, has anybody continued dating, talking? Like, what have you kind of seen? What has been their feedback afterwards?
Yeah. So before I go into that, hearing you talk about the vulnerability, I want to share the kind of inspiration for the app and where it came from, because there's a moment there that I think really connects to what you were saying. So the inspiration came from eating at a blackout restaurant where I got to know people in complete darkness, having no idea what they looked like. And we had a beautiful conversation. Afterwards, I saw them for the first time and realized, had I seen them beforehand, I would have, written them off as people I wouldn't have anything in common with. And during the dinner, though, the thing that was really beautiful beyond just our conversation and how open we were, I remember there was actually somebody who had a birthday and the entire restaurant burst out singing happy birthday at like a cadence and like a volume that I'd never heard before. And I think it's because there was this, shroud of darkness on them where, nobody's judging who's singing so loudly or how they're singing it. And so it was just kind of incredible to see how people let loose when they're not seen. And so it was just, I don't know, a really beautiful moment and kind of a reminder that, we're really self-conscious. It's not just about how we think about other people when we see them. It's also how do we think we're being perceived when we're being seen, and removing the visual when you're first getting to know someone. That isn't to say attraction isn't important. It just means that maybe that's not most important when you're thinking about building a lifetime partnership with someone. And so just going to that, I wanted to share that story. To your question about, matches in our podcast, we had a 50% match rate, which is amazing. It's 5x of what traditional dating apps have. Granted, it's not at scale, so it's not statistically significant. And we're really excited to see what that'll look like down the line. We had some folks go on real life dates. We know some people are still in real life friends. I don't know that any of them are currently in romantic partnerships. And this is from season 1. We had 17 couples. Season 2, which we're recording right now, has been really great. We've had a couple of dates so far and they've matched. We haven't followed up with them quite yet, but I'm hoping maybe we'll get a match out of season 2.
I love that. Yeah, it's interesting. You were talking about the vulnerability and not even just in dating, just in general, how do we look and how are we being perceived and am I doing it right? When you take that away, the difference it is. And I will even say, in the dating space, before we even got into COVID and all of that, and I would do the dating apps, I always did a phone call first. And I could tell almost immediately, no, and and that might sound horrible, but it just eliminated why waste either of our time. And you could be like, oh, this picture's attractive, but this person can't hold a conversation, or we don't really have a lot in common. So, or maybe someone comes with something very offensive and you're like, oh, okay, we're not on the same page here. Right. So it kind of eliminates that. But it's interesting that you talk about that and how again, kind of going in and just having this conversation. So I'm curious for you, I've been thinking about this a lot. I always am fascinated by human connection. When you think of human connection, what does that mean to you? And how does that fit into the way that people have a conversation with one another?
I think human connection is so complicated. There have been studies around romantic relationships and platonic relationships, and study after study, it basically shows like there's no logic. People aren't logical. You might find somebody who checks off every single box that you've ever kind of thought of, and you still might not be interested in having a relationship with them because something is missing. And so I don't know that I think there's a great logic, but I do think that you're right. Like, having a conversation with someone is far more important than being able to, being attracted to, their profile, or being able to have great banter with them over texting. Being able to actually be in the moment with someone and feel that connection, which can be born of so many different things. That's what's really important. And like, that might be in the context of a romantic relationship or in the context of a platonic relationship. You might be friends with somebody who's totally different from you, who had a totally different background from a totally different part of the world, just because you have something in common that brings you together and makes that time together special. And so, I feel like that's a non-answer, but I guess the bottom line in my mind is that people are complicated. They're not logical. And so a lot of these algorithms that apply in these dating apps that are like, oh, you're this type of person. Other people like you who look like you or live in your place or your age, like profiles like this. So we're going to show you profiles like this too. That's not going to work. And maybe it does just by chance, but it's not, AI can't solve this problem. You can't have a machine say this person is a good match for you. It might, and it might be right. But realistically, like, you might also just match with somebody that you would never expect to.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too when you're talking about the algorithm, because there are some dating apps and some other types of apps also that assume your interest in another ethnicity. So because I'm white, they're only going to show me white people. Or, because of a certain age group, or like you said, obviously location and who the male, female, whatever you're attracted to is important. Right. But it is interesting, like you said, where it thinks it's learning, right, but you're like, wait, I don't fit into that box. You know what I mean? Right. Like, and I think we see that in a lot of different things. We've talked about this. I know I've talked about it a lot. When we look at technology, where are those biases coming from? Sometimes they are coming from the way someone has made those applications, the way it's learned. Are there things that you're thinking about as you kind of build this company about how to kind of prevent that so that it is more personalized, but obviously you still want something that's more efficient, that's not done fully by a human?
Yeah. So, our MVP, like I said, is super basic. We're just doing the age, location, sexuality. What it'll look like down the line, we're going to kind of see what user feedback is and let that guide us, but never along the lines of something that's like appearance based or a mutable characteristic like ethnicity or height or things like that, because we fundamentally just don't believe that should be a reason that you consider having a conversation with someone or not. And, maybe that isn't right for everyone. And some people are like, nope, I only want to date someone who fits into this box. Like, okay, maybe you want to try, finding love someplace else. But from our perspective, you just can't put your connection to someone in a box like that. Like, that's just not how we should be thinking about humans and connecting with people. And we really want to help people meet folks that they might not have otherwise. And I think another thing that we see a lot is, people keep dating the same type. And, the whole thing is like, insanity is repeating things that don't work. What is that quote? I can't remember.
Yes.
And so we'll date the same types of people and have the same types of problems, and our relationships won't succeed. And we'll never think like, oh, maybe I should date somebody different. Like, and so we're giving people that chance without like making them actively choose it, by essentially putting the conversation first. And if you jive, if you have a good connection, then great, you can move on and see the photos. And psychologically, relationships, typically your attraction grows as your connection grows. And so we're giving people the chance to really lean into that.
I love that. Has there been any of the conversations that you've, again, because you kind of hosted, that you've listened and you're like, ooh, like you can feel the connection between them? And if so, what do you think it was about that moment or that conversation or those people that allowed that to happen?
There were a few from season 1, and I actually just hosted one last night that I was like, the whole time I was like, they're going to match. And actually at the end of the season, my co-host and I, we go through each episode and say what our predictions were. For the most part, we were right, but it's funny. Sometimes like we were totally like on opposite pages where I was like, they're going to match. And my co-founder was like, no, they're not going to. For me, what I thought, would contribute to a match is like folks who have a conversation instead of one person kind of dominating it. And so that means listening, asking questions, actually hearing the answers and responding, based on that answer rather than just continuing to talk about, that same thing and, ignoring what they said. And so people were really able to, bounce off of each other. And so in some cases, that means they were having a really lighthearted conversation and laughing a lot. In other cases, it meant having a really deep conversation where they were vulnerable with each other. But at the end of the day, they were kind of picking up what the other person put down and kind of putting something down in turn. And so those are the conversations that I always am like, they're going to match. These two are a good fit.
And that's, that brings up something I think a lot of people, I thought it was just a female thing, but I've actually heard a lot of men talk about it too, where they go on a date and it's like an interview. One person's asking questions, one's responding, and you're like, okay. And I do interviewing, obviously. So sometimes I'm like, okay, maybe I should stop asking questions. Like I evaluate myself, but it's weird, like obviously some people are more curious than others. I don't know if it's an anxiety. I don't know what it is, but as you just mentioned, which is very true, it's a turnoff, right? Because there has to be a back and forth. So do you have maybe just of your own advice, how can people that maybe aren't as good at asking questions, or maybe they've been told like, maybe they're not aware. I don't know. Maybe that's part of the problem, but any way to be able to engage in a conversation to keep it going so that both people have this kind of equal give and take and pull.
I think asking a question about what the other person just said is a really easy way to do it. So you don't need to come up with your own questions. The other person's going to give you something to ask about. So if someone tells you like, oh, I really love X sport, you could say, what do you love about it? Or do you love playing it or watching it? Or, when did you start loving it? Or, and there are all sorts of ways you can take that conversation, but ask something about what they just said. It's really, really simple. The 4 W's, 5 W's, yes. Where, what, why, when, like just choose one of those and ask a question based on what they said. And you're now having a conversation instead of an interview. And ideally both people will do that. So, somebody, I love sports. Why do you love it? They share something and you can kind of try to relate and say, oh, I really like that thing about that too. Or, I really like that thing about this other thing, in my life. And that way you can connect with them. You can show them that you're listening. And again, you're having a conversation instead of just kind of bouncing back and forth meaninglessly.
Yes. I was actually thinking that as you said that about like, who, what, when, where, why, how, anything that starts with that is a question. And it's not just about that one conversation. It's something that has to continue, in relationships as a whole. So I think if you're starting in that place, that's great. I love all of this. And I know actually you have a date that you are getting, not that you're attending, but that you are hosting as part of your thing this evening. So before we end, could you tell people where they can listen to the podcast, where they can learn more about the work you're doing, or maybe if they want to be one of the people on these dates, where can they learn more?
Yeah. So the podcast, like I said, is Date in a Blink, and we're on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Anchor, any podcasting platform, we're on it. And we're also on social media at Date in a Blink. If you want to sign up, folks can go to dateinablink.com, and we've got a form there that just asks that basic information about kind of age, location, sexuality, and we match folks based on that. I'm human algorithm for that. So for folks who are applying for that, I'm super excited for them to sign up and to try to find them a match. And if folks are interested in the app, or like I said, we're launching very soon. That's just The Blink Date. Our website is theblinkdate.com. The app itself is Blink Date. Our social media is The Blink Date. So super easy to find us there.
Perfect. And the last question I ask all of my guests, Taly, is what is one word or quote or mantra that you try to live by every single day?
I had one, and it just I have one that I always hold on to, and for some reason it's just escaped me. One that's been resonating with me very recently, that I wouldn't say has always been my mantra, but recently, a ladder with more rungs is easier to climb. And the reason I say that is because, building something is really, really hard. Seeing that thing at the top that you want to do and being like, oh, how do I get there? That's really overwhelming. But once you add rungs, once you think about things like, oh, I can do this very small thing to get myself a tiny bit closer, and then I'll do this other small thing that's next. Once you start thinking about it in terms of tiny little pieces, it makes it so much easier to get there. And so I would just encourage folks to think of that ladder, add rungs for yourself, instead of just being like, I will never get there, it's too far away.
I love it. Well, I thank you so much. Anything that encourages us to connect to people, to the right people, to create these experiences, I'm a huge fan of. So I'm so glad that we connected. I'm excited to see and hear more about this. And I thank you so much for being here.
Thank you again for having me.